To give today's 7 talk, we welcome John Hamilton, class of 1966. We are delighted to have John here. Thank you so much for being here, and I am pleased to invite you to tell us your story.
One August afternoon in 1959, the summer I was 15, my brother and I rode bicycles out to meet our friend Jimmy to swim in a nearby lake. We lived out in the country south of Charlotte, and the route was over gravel, dusty roads. Jimmy had said he'd be riding or driving his father's beat-up old Ford tractor. As we approached a sharp bend, here came the tractor, careening around the curve on 2 wheels. The driver was not Jimmy, however, but a stranger, a young black man. He tore past us, churning up rocks and dust, and was gone in an instant. It was pretty clear what had happened. Jimmy had been pushed off the tractor or knocked on the head, and the tractor stolen. Fearing the worst, we hurried on, expecting to find Jimmy lying in a ditch. But a minute or two later, here came Jimmy, perfectly fine, puttering along on his father's old Ford tractor. It was absolutely identical to the one we had just seen. It still amazes me, these 61 years later, how something that had appeared to be so clearly, so emphatically and unmistakably one thing had turned out to be another thing altogether. My wife, Donna, never knew her father. He served in the US Army during the Second World War, seeing combat in North Africa, Sicily, and Western Europe. At the end of the war, he wrote Donna's mother, Betty, and asked for a divorce and married a woman he had met in Germany. And in fact, he never came home from the war. At the time of their parents' divorce, Donna's oldest sister, Diane, and Donna were respectively 2 years and 2 months old. Donna had told me her childhood fantasy was that one day Daddy would just appear at the door. But he never did, and she never met him, not even once. She, of course, wondered why she was unworthy of his love. There was a single photo of him that Donna's mother had kept of him and her together. Here it is. I've always thought that the camera in this case captured his essence. For me, this is the photo of a Lieutenant Pinkerton, a man who would abandon his wife and daughters, leaving them to fend for themselves emotionally and financially. His smile looks more like a smirk. His expression is self-satisfied, cocksure. No doubt about it, this man is a cad. I internalized Donna's anger and hurt, but concluded she'd been better off with him out of her life. A minor saving grace for me was that throughout our 47-year marriage, well, at least she wasn't comparing me to Daddy unfavorably. It was our daughter, Erin, who after Donna died a year and a half ago, became curious to know more about her maternal grandfather. Donna had told us one really interesting thing, that he had commanded the army unit that liberated Dachau, the Nazi concentration camp near Munich. In a matter of hours, Erin had located a memoir online written by Donna's father and the men in his unit. Their brigade had encountered resistance as they approached Dachau, but they were able to suppress the incoming fire and take control. All of the men reported never fully getting over what they saw. A freight train ready to move out, its boxcars full of corpses emaciated beyond their capacity to fathom. In the memoir, Donna's father tells his part of the story in straightforward, unembellished prose. His one concession to affect being that he refers throughout to my men. The accounts by the men in his unit mentioned him frequently. It's clear they adored him. You could talk back to Lieutenant Colonel Donald Downer. He wouldn't write you up for insubordination. He didn't ask you to do something dangerous that he wasn't willing to do himself. In fact, he habitually led the way into battle atop a tank, exposing himself to incoming fire, the better to have a complete view of the battlefield. He looked after his men. A biographic sketch in the memoir says he stayed in the Army through the Korean War, leaving then with a disability. He settled in Texas, working in a variety of NGOs and Veterans Affairs. He was active in his church, Scouts, Little League, volunteer firemen, you name it. He was liked and widely respected. The community grieved his death in 1994. Elsewhere, we found more. He had won 2 Silver Stars for valor in combat. There was also a Bronze Star and a slew of Purple Hearts. Most stunning of all for me, there was a photo of him we had never seen before. Here it is. Now, is this even the same man in the photo I just showed you? Well, yeah, but this is the photo of an idealistic man, one capable of compassion and of heroism. It's just one of those regrets in life that I'll never know enough about him to know for sure how these two contrasting images might be reconciled. To know how a man who risked his life for his country repeatedly and who cared so much for the men under his command could be so indifferent to the welfare of his wife and 2 little girls. These 2 cases of me rushing to judgment bookend my life. But I gotta tell you, the intervening years were full of similar instances. I've had to learn over and over again not to form opinion of others quickly, to distrust instincts distorted by my likes, dislikes, biases, and insecurities, to cultivate instead a habit of open-minded curiosity about people. F. Scott Fitzgerald begins The Great Gatsby with his protagonist, Nick Carraway, ruminating on just this subject. Carraway acknowledges the risk of withholding judgment, that monumental bores will just glom onto you, for example. But he believes that restraining the impulse to form opinion quickly makes him more observant, that when he fails to restrain it, he misses something illuminating or consequential. And in just a phrase, he offers as well this startling insight, that reserving judgment is an expression of infinite hope. If I could live my life over again, I'd resolve to do it with that kind of optimism.
Thank you, John. Wonderful. Seeing some claps out there. The floor is certainly open for questions, compliments, other examples.
I have an observation maybe, that in so many of these cases of police brutality that we've witnessed in the past several months in our country on video, it seems to have come from a mindset of rushing to judgment. Whatever terrible things happened in the moment, it was from someone in a position of authority rushing to judgment. And it's funny because in our educations, we think that people's intellectual capabilities are shown by their quickness, by their ability to draw fast conclusions in ambiguous circumstances. I remember both as an undergraduate and in graduate school being so impressed with the people who seem to have instant opinions on everything. It does seem to be a mark of superior intellect, but maybe we're wrong, right? Maybe Plato's distinction between appearance and reality, maybe Plato's image of the cave, maybe Socrates' questioning of people who seemed so quickly sure of what courage was or justice or piety, showed something, because it always puzzled me why Socrates in Plato's dialogues leaves his interlocutors in a state of confusion. He doesn't try to come up with his own quick answer. It's almost as if he values the withholding of judgment. Maybe he values the confusion as a potentially powerful thing that we miss when we rush to judgment. So, I mean, just hearing you tell these two powerful stories just started my neurons flashing with the history of philosophy and our modern societal problems, where political partisans rush to judgment at the drop of a slogan, and it seems to be responsible for all our troubles. Now, what could have been very important in human prehistory, right? Is that something I can eat, or is that something that can eat me? And being able to form a snap judgment in those circumstances is so important. But in the complexity of modern life, in the complexity of civilized life, the ability to wait, to take a moment, take a breath, take a pause. I'll just say one more thing. I finished last January working on a book for 15 years about how to deal with difficulties in our lives. And my first principle was don't rush to judgment. So your stories today have just resonated deeply with me. I thought they were extremely well told and extremely powerful stories, because we can imagine tragedies that could have occurred in both those stories by people rushing to judgment. And it's kind of a lesson to us all, I think, that we need right now.
Well, I know you're all going to think that I lined up Tom Morris in advance to be ready with that learned, informed observation, but it's serendipitous. Thank you, Tom. That was really brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I have just a question, John, if you don't mind speaking to, I think you said your daughter did this research after Donna had passed away, and I wonder if you don't mind speculating on how she would have reacted to learning some of this, if that's not too personal of a question.
You know, I've got a hunch she wouldn't have been that surprised, that she might have inferred a lot of that from the single fact that her mother had passed on about his role. And she was a person of great emotional reserve herself. So I think she would have dealt with it with equanimity.
John, when we hear a story like that, we really yearn for the explanation. And did you come close, or did she come close to making sense of why he had not come back?
Well, one's imagination would, of course, work on the horror and the trauma of what he saw and how he perhaps just couldn't quite imagine going back to Olympia, Washington, where his wife and daughters were and fitting in. But it turns out, I now know, since first sitting down to write this, that his marriage to Donna's mother was not his first marriage. So some of this behavior of inability to commit to a woman and family predates the wartime combat and the horror of DACA. So no, but I mean, I think as entitled, I think, as everybody connected to him is to form a fairly harsh judgment about his decision and his behavior vis-a-vis Betty and Donna and Diane. You still just have to stop and say, but you don't know everything. You don't know everything about their relationship, of course. Donna's mother never talked critically of him or harshly of him. She was pretty matter of fact herself, kind of a frontierish Western woman.
Now I've formulated a question. So I'm going to jump back in real quick, as if I haven't talked enough already. But John, did you learn this lesson early on about not rushing to judgment, or did you, like most of us, form your opinions on roller skates going fast down a hill?
Oh, the latter. I mean,
yeah. How did it become a thing for you? How did the light switch come on?
Well, I think, just in recent years, there just seems to be a quality of judgmentalness that has crept into our public culture. And I just found that very disheartening, but as I reflect on it and tempted to urge better behavior on others, it invited some self-reflection. And I think it was about at that point that Megan asked me to think about something that I might talk about to you. So I opted for that.
That's good.
I don't want to, it's such a lovely story. And I have to say that Emily and I were privileged to get a preview of it. And I was glad because I could get all my tears out during that version and sort of hold it together this time. But thank you again, John. It's really a lovely story. But it makes me think, you were talking about Donna's personality, and I thought that seemed suited to both of your careers in diplomacy and sort of going around the world and having to deal with different cultures. Is there a story about sort of how, I don't know, her personality and yours came into play in your careers that you might tell as well?
Well, I should have anticipated this question. I mean, after all, it's not that hard to have thought of in advance. But I think, as Tom was saying, we were operating in a professional environment that certainly put a premium on forming relationships and making judgments quickly, and if not the fog of war, certainly in an ambience of the fog of ambiguity. And with the cross-cultural overlay to make matters even more complicated. And now Donna worked in consular affairs, and particularly on the visa side of consular affairs, both immigrant and non-immigrant visa issuance. And so she was in the position of making judgments that were of monumental importance to the people who were applying for a visa, whether it was a tourist visa or an immigrant visa. a student visa or whatever. And the 400 people lined up outside the embassy put a premium on making a decision in a matter of 3 to 5 minutes per applicant. I worked in political affairs, so there was a premium in her case on making decisions very quickly. My impression is that she got really good at it. I was working in political affairs sort of for much of my career and worked the way a foreign correspondent for a major newspaper might work, but instead of a public readership, I had a readership of government officials back in Washington and in other embassies. But I typically had more time than Donna did to think my way through a situation that I was trying to make comprehensible to Washington. And so I think I have, there was less urgency, and I have less excuse for all the mistakes in judgment that I made. Sorry, no anecdote that really sums that up, Megan, but I hope that's responsive.
John, on that theme, I wonder, this feels a little trivial compared to Donna's father's story, but I wonder if there were professional diplomatic rushes to judgment that you might share with us.
Well, I remember, I have a vivid memory of making a judgment about a Foreign Service officer that came to Lima after I'd been there for a year and to take up an important position in the embassy. And I was just horrified at what I initially judged to be his propensity for calling attention to himself. He was a wonderful speaker of Spanish and just absolutely fluent. And he would grab the floor at a dinner party, even when he had nothing of substance in particular to say. And we were dazzled by how well he spoke Spanish. And so I started off just thinking, how did I allow myself to have this guy assigned to me and to my embassy? And in about 3 or 4 months, I had changed my opinion of him just totally. I also, to give you more substantive, something having more to do with diplomacy, I worked toward the latter part of my career on the peace process in Guatemala. And there was an international diplomatic process that was being mediated by the United Nations, involving the Guatemalan government and military on one side, and the grouping, federation of guerrilla groups on the other. And then there was a so-called support group of 8 countries, of which the US was one. And I was the representative of the US to this support group of the diplomatic process. The role that I played was in coordination with the UN mediator, was to meet with the guerrilla commanders prior to each negotiating session, because we both judged that what the US had to do was to convince them that we would support an agreement that they reached, that it would have our political, moral, and financial backing. And so that was something that took time because they entered into their contacts with me deeply suspicious. I was really about the first US government official that they had ever encountered, with one important exception. One of the four we believe to have been the trigger man in the assassination in 1968 of the US ambassador to Guatemala. So this is the man that I met with, had dinner with, and he was somebody who had been capable of assassination of a guy that everybody thought was one of the most wonderful men that American diplomacy ever produced. And so I came to have, but it took time, I came to have a lot of respect for this guy. You know, I came to see that he was really committed to a cause, that there was substantial elements of idealism and political commitment to a vision of a different society in Guatemala that had driven him to a whole life of because that war lasted for 36 years. So that was an instance of I suppose of reserving judgment enough that I was able to come to a view of him that I think helped achieve the outcome that we were all working for, which was a peace agreement that more or less has worked. It put an end to the war. It hasn't produced the political utopia that we had hoped for, but it did stop the fighting.
Thank you.
John. Where do you do?
Go ahead,
John, I have a question. I wonder if you could say a little more about personal safety concerns when you were in Peru and also Guatemala, because my impression is that at least today those are fairly dangerous places to live at this point. I don't know how much different it was when you and Donna were there.
Well, we were in Peru twice, 86 to 89, and then went back 10 years later when I was ambassador, 99 to 2002. The first time was actually the more dangerous time for US diplomats because there were two guerrilla insurgencies going on at the time. The Shining Path insurgency, which was Maoist in its orientation and behavior, just horrendously brutal. And then there was a pro-Cuban sort of traditional Latin American guerrilla group. The latter, while less violent, was operating in the cities, whereas at this point, the Shining Path was still largely up in the highlands. Although in the last year we were there, they started coming down the highways into the coastal cities, and their methodology of preference was to use dynamite that they had gotten from the mining companies up in the highlands. And they would blow up the electrical towers and plunge the cities into darkness, and then carry out other dynamite attacks on selected targets. I mean, at the time that when we left in 1989, I did so sort of with survivor's guilt, because it really did not look like Peru was ever going to get a handle on these insurgencies. They subsequently did. But, you know, during the 3 years that we were there, Donna and I followed the advice of the embassy security system and State Department security system. We worked in different locations. We each drove to work. We would leave the house at a different time every day. We would take a different route to the office, arriving at a time that was unpredictable. The philosophy or the thinking behind this defensive behavior is that terrorist groups always surveil targets to better plan how they are going to attack, kidnap, or shoot, or blow somebody up. And if you're unpredictable in your movements, then they switch to an easier target. Now, during the time that we were there, Donna's offices were blown up, but at night. These pro-Cuban groups were really very humanistic in their approach. So nobody was hurt, but just completely destroyed her offices, and it would have been just horrific, catastrophic if they had done it during the day or during working hours. Now, when I went back as ambassador, the security situation was better. I mean, the guerrilla groups were still there 3 days before George W. Bush came on a state visit. The Shining Path, by that time operating in the cities, set off a fairly large bomb right in front of the embassy gates. And that killed 3 people out on the street, across the street. And now as ambassador, I had almost as much security as the president did. 11 different security guards with me at any given time outside the embassy. If I was going somewhere, there was an advance car that would go and check out the location I was going to. As we went along in my own armored car, we had an advance car immediately in front and one immediately behind us. And then, of course, I had 2 guys armed to the teeth in the car with me. And this took a bit of getting used to. I can remember the first time stepping into the men's room and looking to my right and recognizing my security guards. But that was sort of, it just came with the turf. And a smaller detail in Guatemala. In both cases, the concern by the time I was ambassador there was not from terrorists so much as from narcotics traffickers, because they could be very violent, and they did occasionally go after US government officials. But it was just a part of life. But what you do is you kind of, you sort of suppress the anxiety that's there, and you become aware of it only as you leave the country. I can remember just the wave of relief lifting as Donna and the girls and I left Peru in 1989 and looked back and saw the lights of Lima fading behind us. But it was also, as I say, with guilt, because we were leaving behind a lot of friends, and Peruvian and American, that we thought were really in danger. That's pretty long-winded, Walter, sorry.
No, that's interesting.
Can I jump in with, there's a couple of questions in the chat. So the first is sort of it's a little slightly off topic, but interesting. Peter McCullough, whose mic is not working. He's class of 1986. He said he would jump in himself, but his mic is not working. But his question is, a couple of years ago, a few weeks back, George Hodgin gave a 7 talk about his interest in legalizing or commercializing cannabis in the US. And Peter's curious if you would be willing to speculate on whether Latin America would proceed or follow the US in legalization or decriminalization of cannabis. And if you have no idea, that's fine. Just sort of curious based on your locations for your career.
I suspect they'd be greatly relieved. They might not be above taking some pot shots at us for about, you know, after all these years, now you're going to legalize it. But I think that the centrality of this issue in the bilateral relationship is so distorting and distracting of the other interests of more importance to them. They would be happy to see at least cannabis at least taken off the table.
Thank you. And one of our staff members, Montez Thomas, Scholar Advisor, has a question for you as well.
Okay.
Yeah, John, thanks for this talk. This has really been great. My question for you is a bit of for you to put on your Nostradamus hat, I guess, and predict the future for us. But given what you've seen in, you know, all these various countries, and given what you see currently going on in the U.S., do you have? It's a two-part question. A, do you have any concerns about potential violence or, you know, things happening surrounding this election? And if so, to what degree, you know, are your concerns, just based on what you've seen and are hearing and things like that?
Yeah, you know, 10 years ago, I wrote a piece that the Seattle Times ran on income inequality. This was before the Occupy movement got going. And I drew upon the work of others, of course, and made the case that I had seen in Latin America the poisoning effects of a democratic into a democratic process of inequality, and just made the case that you know, I didn't want to see the U.S. go where Latin America has gone, places like Guatemala, Venezuela, all of the Andean countries, Mexico as well. But, you know, I think, and since then, our concern about the pervasive and pernicious effects of income and wealth inequality have only grown greater. Now, and as to this election, I have been just about as anxious and at times morose about what might happen as anybody, and I've stayed attuned to the horrifying scenarios that Informed Opinion in the Atlantic magazine has laid out for all of us. But I think in recent weeks, I've begun to have confidence that the election is going to be so one-sided that there just won't be enough ambiguity about the outcome to sustain the violence. And I think in Biden, we have a person who's going to be capable of handling victory in a way that will just sap the animus toward violence that might otherwise be out there. I hope that's not too optimistic, but I mean, I do think at some level there's still a reservoir of common sense, goodwill, and charity in the American people that Biden might know how to draw out.
Could I ask, I'm risking exile here and coming to the well 3 times. But as an outsider, as just a citizen of the country, I've been worried for a few years about what seems to me to be the sidelining and gutting of the State Department. And I wanted to ask you what your sense is of how long that takes to restore, because apparently we've had a lot of good longtime civil servants leave because they just couldn't stand the conditions and circumstances under which they were being asked to serve or not serve, as the case may be. What do you think about that, our timeline now with a restoration of such an important function of the government?
Well, I'm hopeful that a Biden presidency might be able to lure some of these people that still had 5 or 8 years left in a career back into the service. And now, you know, they've had to earn an income, and they may have made commitments, landed jobs, and have no desire to go back. But I can also imagine that there would be a strong moral argument that could be put to them to come back in. But I was in Washington a year ago, and I came back to DC and saw a lot of Foreign Service friends, including a number who are still in the department, all of whom have managed to find jobs, out-of-line jobs, often as a resident scholar, a resident diplomat at this university, or teaching in the foreign affairs, but not line jobs where they have to toe the line on policy. Now, what I heard from them was worse than what I had read, which was that it's not just the people at the top who have left, but it's been the best and the brightest of the mid-ranks cohorts, people who were just beginning to approach senior ranks, and who were going to be the the leaders over the next 10 or 12 years, as the cohort at the top currently retired and left the service. So it's harder to imagine those people being brought back in. So I think that rebuilding is going to be long-term.
Yeah.
John, we have another question from the chat. Question is from Peter again, whose mic is not working. Do you consider a tax on wealth a potential solution to our income inequality? Tax on wealth in addition.
A tax on wealth? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, I personally.
I'm sorry, I'll just give you his scenario, and then I'd love to hear the rest. Sorry about that. Say very wealthy individuals would pay 1% of their wealth per year. If 1% is too high, then phase it in or pick a different number. As it is, wealthy families can avoid income taxes and preserve wealth across generations. There you go. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm frankly, I was much more conversant with this subject 10 years ago. But I think remedies to wealth and asset inequality and income inequality would not have to be particularly radical to make a difference, a positive difference. And so, I'm hopeful that if we do get a Biden administration, and if the Senate is taken back, then we can get some steps in that direction. I'm definitely of the reformist incrementalist school, sort of much of the conservative outlook that I was born and inculcated with as a youngster. It has stayed with me long enough that I don't favor abrupt change, but I think we can do things that are really important and that can make a difference without radicalizing the entire country.
Great. We have another sort of a philosophical question from the chat from an anonymous person who says, as I'm sitting here, I'm finding that it seems like the corollary to judgment is forgiveness. Would you speak to that relationship? How these instances of rushing to judgment have perhaps made you more forgiving of yourself and others?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good, thoughtful observation. I think you know, as you think back upon your own life and you realize that you're in no position to judge others, and forgiveness is the only thing that works in those circumstances.
Wonderful. Any further questions or observations? We have had a wonderful, generous amount of time here with John. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
It's really.
Thank you all for tuning in.